Hello, welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County's Curator's Corner. I'm Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. We started these weekly programs a few months ago to draw attention to particular objects in our collection, to give them some context and to explore the museum while the building is closed. Before I begin, let me make two other comments. One is to, as always, to let you or to encourage you to please write in any questions you have using the Q&A feature. And the second is to remind you of an appeal that we have currently going on. We're trying to raise $20,000 to support our virtual programs like this for the fall. We're looking for 200 people to give $100 donations. I'm grateful for those of you who've already given, but if you haven't, I hope that you'll consider making a contribution to sustaining these kinds of virtual programs. Just go to our website, www.hmtcli.org, and hit the Give Now button. And please give $100 to support these programs. Okay, today I'm going to talk about a photograph in our gallery of a GI named Hy Horowitz, who served in the 7th Armored Division under General Patton during World War II. Hy was an active docent at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for many years and gave generously of his time, his energy, and his money. While he passed away in 2016, his photograph in our gallery is a reminder of both his wartime service and his work with the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. And I want to express my gratitude to his family, particularly his son Marty, for sharing their information about Hy with me. There are good reasons to talk about Hy Horowitz regardless of any particular anniversary, but I will mention that throughout 2020, we and other museums across the country are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Here in Nassau County, the various historical organizations got together with the county and made a special seal to promote these programs, suggesting the honor that we all hold for our veterans who fought in that war. We had programs earlier in the spring to mark both the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau and the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. We also had a program right after Flag Day where I spoke about another GI who is included in our museum, Jim Van Ralt, and his service in the Ghost Army. And while there's no particular anniversary today, this program fits into this larger group of programs that we've been holding to recognize the men and women who successfully defeated the Axis powers 75 years ago this year. In reality, of course, World War II did not end at one single moment, but as a rolling event that followed the Allied forces. Formally, the war in Europe ended on VE Day, when Nazi Germany gave their unconditional surrender on May 8th of 1945. But towns in Italy saw the end come earlier in 1943, and in France after D-Day on June 6th of 44. The wave of liberation sometimes rushed forwards and sometimes came to a halt or even eddied backwards, but gradually washed over Nazi-controlled Europe from west, east, and south. But sometimes lost in the remembrances about the end of the war is the fact that the soldiers like Hy Horowitz were not only greeted by cheering crowds as they marched through Europe, but instead by fierce fighting. And indeed, Hy was in the middle of some of the worst of it. The brief caption that we have on his photograph only hints at the broad experience that he saw during his wartime service. He fought in the Normandy invasion on June 6th of 44, and if that was not enough, he also was in the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during the war, where Americans suffered 90,000 casualties. And he went on to liberate the concentration camp of Ohrdruf and to help in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. In 2009, as you can see, he was also inducted into the Legion of Honor in France as Chevalier or Knight. In some ways, Hy Horowitz was like many other GIs who served during World War II. He came from rural America, having grown up in Swan Lake, New York, about 10 miles north of where the Woodstock Music Festival would be in 1969, and about 55 miles due west from Poughkeepsie. In 1920, when he was born, it was an agricultural hamlet that felt much further from the busy streets of Manhattan than it does today. His parents were Russian immigrants who had been given the land in Sullivan County because it was thought to be of little use for farming, but they made a go of it regardless. The stock market crash of 1929 and the depression that followed made things very tough on High's family, forcing him to drop out of school and to help with the family business. Things changed for High, like for many future GIs, on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. High enlisted shortly after that and was sent down to Fort Polk in Louisiana to train with the 7th Armored Division. Our photograph was taken in the spring of 1942 in Fort Polk, when the brutality of the war was still in the future for High. He certainly did not know then, as he stood posing for this photograph, that 3 years later, he and his armored division would burst through the fences around what appeared to be a military installation in central Germany to become one of the first Americans to see firsthand the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp. Today, most Americans have some sense about what took place in those camps. There are museums like ours in Glen Cove, or the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., or Yad Vashem in Israel, and dozens of others across the country that seek to educate visitors about the history of the Holocaust. There are also films, video testimonies, books, and memorials that enable people today to learn about what happened in those camps. But in 1944, despite efforts by the Polish resistance fighters to get word out about Nazi atrocities, most Allied soldiers had no idea that the Nazis had implemented a plan to kill all the Jews of Europe, nor of the treatment of prisoners in concentration camps. It was the Red Army that discovered the first Nazi death camps when they arrived at Majdanek near the Polish town of Lublin, where around 80,000 Jews had been murdered and burned. Soviet soldiers, although familiar with Nazi atrocities and mass shootings, found evidence of a completely different scale of murder than they'd seen before. They found even more evidence of Nazi barbarism 6 months later after pushing the Germans out of the Polish city of Krakow and discovering the camp at Auschwitz, where 1 million Jews were killed, mostly with gas, and then burned in industrial crematoria. The Red Army quickly sent in investigators and war correspondents to document the scope of Nazi atrocities and to prepare the first news materials for the press. You would have thought that the Red Army's discovery of Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz in the summer of 1944 and the winter of 1945, that would have meant that Americans and other allies were well prepared for what to expect as they moved in from the West. But Americans were reluctant to believe that the Holocaust was taking place. This lack of belief was partially due to anti-Semitic bias and thinking such reports were fabrications, but it was also based on an unwillingness to comprehend what previously had been unimaginable. The reluctance also stemmed from the memory of the aftermath of World War I, when atrocity stories that had come out during the war proved in the aftermath to be unfounded. Many American leaders and members of the American public treated information about Nazi atrocities as similar exaggerations or falsehoods. The skepticism was even shared by the press. Alexander Worth, a British war correspondent for the Sunday Times, who visited Majdanek shortly after it was liberated and saw firsthand gas chambers, mass graves, and mounds of human remains, was surprised by the response he got when he tried to publish his story with the BBC. They said they thought it was a Russian propaganda stunt and refused to publish it. The New York Herald was equally reluctant to publish the story and wrote to him claiming that even on top of all we've been taught of the maniacal Nazi ruthlessness, this example sounds inconceivable. It was only when Western allies began to discover concentration camps themselves that Americans' attitudes changed. And the big shift for Americans came in April of 1945, when US troops, including High Horowitz, liberated Ohrdruf, one of the subcamps at Buchenwald, located in central Germany, northeast of Frankfurt. The Ohrdruf camp was created in November of 1944, so a relatively late addition to the Nazi camp system. It was created to use slave labor to build an elaborate underground bunker that the Nazis thought might be needed if the Allies took Berlin. While the bunker was not actually completed, by late March of 1945, there were some 12,000 prisoners in Ohrdruf working 12 to 14-hour days on starvation diets, doing heavy manual labor. But in early April, as the Allies closed in, the SS evacuated almost all the prisoners on death marches to Buchenwald. Thousands died or were shot as they were forced north. Those who were too ill to walk were murdered where they lay. In all, somewhere around 7,000 people were murdered in the days before the Allied troops and High Horowitz arrived at Ohrdruf. High said that nobody should ever see what he saw when his tank arrived. Piles of bodies, some covered with lime to get rid of the stench, and others partially incinerated on pyres. With High's passing, we have to turn to other sources to tell us about what he saw. And one of those sources is General Dwight David Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, who visited Ohrdruf with General Omar Bradley and General Patton on April 12th, just a week after High's division had liberated the camp. The visit had a powerful impact on Eisenhower and the other generals. Eisenhower immediately pushed to make the world aware of what they'd found at Ohrdruf. On April 19th, Eisenhower cabled General George Marshall, the head of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C., with a request to bring members of Congress and journalists to the newly liberated camp. He wrote, "We continue to uncover German concentration camps for political prisoners in which conditions of indescribable horror prevail. I visited one of these myself, and I assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date has been understatement. If you could see any advantage in asking about a dozen leaders of Congress and a dozen prominent editors to make a short visit to this theater in a couple of C-54s, I will arrange to have them conducted to one of these places where the evidence of bestiality and cruelty is so overpowering as to leave no doubt in their minds about the normal practices of the Germans in these camps." Marshall was able to get permission that same day for Congress to visit the battlefields and the liberated camp. Ohrdruf made a powerful impression on General Patton, too. He described it as one of the most appalling sights he had ever seen. He recounted in his diary, "When we began to approach with our troops, the Germans thought it expedient to remove the evidence of their crime. Therefore, they placed the bodies on a mammoth griddle composed of 60-centimeter railway tracks laid on brick foundations. They poured pitch on the bodies and then built a fire of pine wood and coal under them. They were not very successful in their operations because there was a pile of human bones, skulls, charred torsos on or under the griddle, which must have accounted for many hundreds." Eisenhower ordered all nearby units who were not on frontline duty to visit the camps at Ohrdruf or another at Nordhausen. According to Eisenhower, even if the average GI didn't know who he was fighting for, he would now at least know what he was fighting against. Eisenhower also invited the world press to come and tour the camp, and newsreel footage from these visits finally reached American movie theaters on May the 1st, 1945, shocking the nation to its core. I am not going to play one of the newsreels, but you can find it on YouTube by looking for April 26, 1945, and a newsreel that was entitled "Nazi Murder Mills." It's graphic, so I'm not going to show it here. I said before that High Horowitz was somewhat representative of many Americans who went to fight during World War II. There was one thing, however, that notably separated High from the great majority of the 16 million Americans who fought in World War II. He was one of the 550,000 Jewish men and women who served. Jews made up less than 4% of the total American population in 1940, but almost half of all eligible Jewish men joined the fight. For High and other Jews fighting in the European theater, liberating the camps and seeing both Jewish victims and survivors was particularly powerful. They knew that if they had been living in Europe themselves, they would very likely be either dead or be the people they were liberating, be the victims that they saw. And this brings me to one other point. We refer to High and the other GIs who served with him as liberators. But the reality was that they did much more than just liberate, much more than just free the prisoners. In a real way, they rescued the inmates of those camps. It was the arrival of Allied troops that saved the prisoners from further brutality and starvation. And GIs like High brought with them food and medical care. Perhaps as importantly, GIs brought smiles and confidence. If you read the accounts of survivors who were liberated, or if you talk with a survivor who was liberated, they often refer to American soldiers who gave their own food or cigarettes or clothing to the prisoners. So I will follow contemporary convention and call Hai a liberator, but he was also, without question, a rescuer. I'll also add that in some ways the rescued, the prisoners, were able to give something to the GIs. Leonard Pinky Popich, an American in the 45th Infantry Division, captured this side of the equation in a letter he wrote to his family 2 days after liberating Dachau. He wrote, "I saw firsthand the things that I've heard about and which I had never quite believed. Now I know what this war is all about. Now I know why we are fighting. To me, all the suffering and misery I've had to put up with these past 8 months has been well worthwhile. Just to see the joy on the faces of these tortured, suffering people repaid all of us that saw 1,000-fold. I'm proud to be one of the many who finally helped free these poor souls who have been through a hell that the decent mind cannot imagine possible here on God's own earth." Let me finish by going back and talking about Hai Horowitz. Hai came back to the US after the war. He got a job, got married, raised a family, moved out to East Meadow on Long Island. But he remained an active member of the 7th Armored Division Association, the organization of veterans from his division, attending annual reunions and returning to towns in France and Belgium that he had liberated in 1944 when they held various commemorations and celebrations about the end of World War II. I heard Hai's son describe how whenever his father was heading out, he'd grab his lucky 7th hat and he was ready to go. These photos capture Hai proudly sporting that hat at some of the events here on Long Island and with some of the folks he knew from the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. But he wore the lucky 7th hat in his many trips to France too. Indeed, he developed lifelong friendships with some of the residents in those French towns as he sought to sustain the connection created during the war between France and America. And it was with that in mind that the French honored Hai Horowitz in 2009 with the National Order of the Legion of Honor, conveying upon him the title of Chevalier, of Knight. It's an honor that was created by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1802 to honor French soldiers who fought with particular bravery, or foreign individuals like Hai Horowitz, who performed acts of valor on French soil. The Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County is honored to include the photograph of Hai Horowitz in our museum and to draw attention to all that he and the other liberators risked as they embraced their role as rescuers. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for watching. And of course, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box and I'll try and answer them. Before we get to that, let me take a moment to remind you of some of our other upcoming programs. This Friday, on August 14th at 2 o'clock, we're holding a tech workshop for 2Gs who already have a presentation that they use to share their parents' story, but are interested in learning how to present that virtually through Zoom. And next Wednesday, August 19th at 11, I'll be back for my next Curator's Corner. I'll be speaking about a photograph that we show of a fire brigade in the Fahrenwald displaced person camp and talking about the survivor George Oscar Lee who helped establish that. And next Thursday, August 20th at 1 o'clock, please join us for our virtual chair yoga fundraiser. This is rescheduled because of the hurricane last week, but I hope you'll be able to make it on August 20th and join us for this program that's suitable for all ages. Okay, you can find a full listing of our programs on our website under the Events tab by going to www.hmtcli.org. And once again, I ask you to make a contribution of $100 and join the 200 people we are looking for to help raise the money we need to sustain our virtual programs this fall. Thanks very much and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.